Recording. Okay, we are recording. I think this is session 8, I believe. I could be wrong, but I think it's around there. We're going to be starting on page 19. For all of you who are listening to the recording now, 19, and we're going to be starting with passions and practice. So we're getting to the end of the introduction. It reminded me of what was that Churchill quote? This is not the end. It's not even the end of the beginning, but it is the beginning of the end. Okay, got that right. So we've got a couple more sections here, and then we're done with the introduction, and we can get into the book proper. He's been going through in this introduction with what you could probably call the overall experience of contemplative practice. And maybe in a way, it's sort of the prerequisites of being able to engage in contemplative practice, which is allowing yourself or having the ability to be awed by the moment, and especially the mundane moment, the usual moment, the normal moment. Nothing spectacular, nothing intense, just going through your day and allowing that experience to awe you, to stun you, to arrest you, to see something in it that you didn't see before, and then to surrender to that awe and shock. In order to do that, you have to be able to strip down. That's the log removal process. Let go of the things, strip down consciously, intentionally, the things that are distracting you, keeping you from being able to see the moment as it is in all its spectacular insignificance. Hey, that's good. Spectacular insignificance. I like that. And then being able to start to seek dispassion. In other words, to be able to regulate emotions and regulate all of our mind-wandering stream of thought. So that's where he's taken us. This next section, passion and practice, is going to build on that last section that was talking about dispassion, all right? Getting to the point where we are not completely just dragged around by our emotions. And now he's going to talk about positive emotions as opposed to just negative emotions. Normally we think about negative emotions as being the distractors, but he's going to introduce the idea that positive emotions can do the same thing to us. Before we dive in, anything that's left over from last week, anything that you've been processing over the last week that you'd like to throw into the mix before we hit some new text. Going once, going twice. All right, here we go. Passions in practice. I'm going to read a couple pages here, and then we'll go back and pick it apart, just so we can get a lay of the land. He says, whenever we feel an excess of emotion, like anger, melancholy, lust, or fear, and see it being primarily caused by something out there, we are making a most common mistake. Sometimes we go further and either blame the victim or play the victim, which are now familiar defenses in many abuse, rape, and even murder cases. She made me do it, or my dad's abuse made me the way I am. Once Christians lose a deep appreciation for the perfect law of freedom and their own capacity for free will, the very foundations of morality and dignity are destroyed. When God made humankind in the beginning, he made them free to make their own decisions. Then Sirach says, and he says, see Ecclesiasticus 15:14. Now that's a book from the Apocrypha, so we'll talk about that in a bit. And even more daringly, we are told at the very beginning, we could eat of all the trees in the garden. God is surely a big risk taker, all for the sake of a deep and authentic love. But it takes real spiritual and emotional maturity to recognize that our response always and finally comes from us. Even if it is much easier to put the responsibility and shame elsewhere instead of finding our own inner freedom. Projecting our dark reservoir elsewhere relieves us of a huge burden. If our egos are still in charge, we will almost certainly resort to this common survival technique. All of life is pulled inside of me as a central reference point, And that is far too small a world. As Jesus would put it, such people have not lost themselves, so they cannot find themselves either. Read that twice. Such people have not lost themselves, so they cannot find themselves either. Most spiritual people think we only have to watch out for the negative or nasty passions, like anger, conceit, envy, avarice, fear, and lust. But after years of observing both myself and many that I have directed, I have come to see that so-called positive emotions and excitements can be just as blinding and narrowing in their practical effect as negative ones. This is a surprise for most of us. Do you know that passions for the early church usually referred to something we suffer and suffer from, in contradistinction to something we consciously and freely choose to do? Passion was not usually referring to sex as we use it today. A passion was probably much closer to what we now mean by an addiction or some compulsive unconscious behavior. Positive, exciting emotions are just as binding and blinding as negative ones, even if they don't first appear that way, because we soon try to sustain them by more entertainments and diversions. It is the Western consumer mind. Okay, I think that's a good place to stop. Any initial reactions, comments to this?
Yeah, when he says that it's I forgot what it's our capacity for free will, but to me too is how about mental illness when you have this depression? You have a chemical neural imbalance. It's not like we're saying, sometimes you make these things in mental illness, it's not in your conscious will to, you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. But it depends on what kind of mental illness you're talking about. If it's something organic, then that's not going to be something that's going to be under our control to fix. I mean, something that's unconscious isn't under our control to fix, but there are ways to work through that. But with an organic mental illness, you're going to need medication to deal with that.
Right.
So, that's kind of a bit of a horse of a different color. But your point is well taken, Ellen, because whenever we start working with something, the first thing we want to do is we want to look at the clinical issues. We want to see if there is anything organic going on, because if there is, then all the talk therapy and all the spiritual direction in the world isn't going to touch that. We have to get that at a place of some sort of equilibrium and then use that to build on. So yes, that's going to absolutely be part of the mix. But it's a little bit beyond the scope of what he's talking about here, I think.
So Dave, when he talks about positive energy and positive, exciting emotions are just as binding and blinding, without reading ahead, I guess, do we think he's alluding to this to becoming kind of an addiction where it starts to feed on itself and then it becomes something bigger than you, or maybe the ego is taking over more? Is that where he's going with this, do we think?
That's exactly where he's going with this, yes. And he's also going to be basically, he doesn't say it directly in the text, but for my money, what he's talking about is that whenever we are beholden to, focused on, immersed in great emotional content, whether it's negative or positive, we tend to identify with it, right? We tend to think it's who we are, or it becomes a big part of our lives to the exclusion of all else. And whether that's negative or positive, it's something that becomes kind of the center of our universe and a huge source of gravity. Best way that I could put that. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and then of course, if it's positive, then we're going to want more of it. And so we're going to continue to be seeking those highs wherever they happen to be coming from, as we would with an addiction, a substance abuse addiction. So that's his analogy to that.
Dave, is that? I want to. Oh, go ahead.
Okay, Ken, then whoever was next. Go ahead, Ken.
Okay. Middle of page 20. I think that's what he is talking about. Such people have not lost themselves, so they cannot find themselves either. It's too limiting to just be addicted to even positive emotions. Is that kind of what he's getting at?
That what the emotion is too limiting? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, if you're addicted even to positive emotions, if you're overwhelmed by any emotion, then the middle of page 20 in italics where he said read that twice, that's what he's talking about, I think. Such people have not lost themselves, so they
Yeah.
cannot find themselves either.
Yes. If you haven't lost your identity, if you haven't stepped away from that identity in whatever is in the egoic mind, then you haven't found yourself, because it requires that step away to be able to really be present to what is present to you in our moments. So yes, I think that's exactly what he's talking about there, and what Jesus is talking about. Yes.
Yeah, if
Go
you're
ahead,
done,
Tony.
I'd like to go next.
Go
Yeah,
ahead.
four lines down from the top of the paragraph, and it talks about blame the victim or play the victim. What follows to me seems like this really broad brush that he's painting when he says that, if we play the victim or blame the victim, it's now familiar defenses for many abuse, rape, and even murder cases. She made me do it. My dad. I think that's what I want to say. I really feel like he's using a very broad brush, and I think it's a very non-constructive way of making his point.
What
I think
paragraph are you looking at, Tony? I'm sorry, where are
I'm
you?
looking at starting at the fourth line down.
Page
from
page
the
19,
top.
William. The first
Yeah.
paragraph we read.
Okay.
Yeah.
Tony, hold on to that thought for just a second, because that's going to be one of the major points that I want to talk about as we go back and start to reconstruct this a bit. So, but
Mhm.
you're in my minds, we're kind of running in the same direction. So just hang on to it. Were there any other general comments before we come back and get Tony's? Okay, let's go back to the top here, page 19. Whenever we feel an excess of emotion like anger, melancholy, lust, or fear, we see it as being primarily caused by something out there. We are making a most common mistake. Sometimes we go further and either blame the victim or play the victim, which are now familiar defenses in many abuse, rape, and even murder cases. So this is right where Tony was at. She made me do it. My dad's abuse made me the way I am. Once Christians lose a deep appreciation for the perfect law of freedom, and he's quoting James 1:25 here, and their own capacity for free will, the very foundations of morality and dignity are destroyed. Obviously, he's talking about the kind of the identification with a victim mentality. And he's trying to make the case that we are still responsible for our own freedom to act. We can't abdicate that responsibility. And if we're looking out there for the reasons that we are acting in a certain way, predictable thought and behavior patterns, then we're missing the fact that those causes to those behavior patterns and thought patterns are inside and often in the unconscious. And so we're looking in the wrong direction. And as long as we're blaming out there, then we're insulating ourselves from being able to make substantive change. So I think, he's making a pretty valid point that I think is pretty well established psychologically and so on and so forth. But to Tony's point, is he painting with too broad a brush? Are there times when there are legitimate reasons that have caused some of these predictable thought and behavior patterns that we need to pay attention to as well? Now, Tony obviously is saying, yes, exclamation point. Right, Tony?
Yeah, okay. Let me first say that I've never been abused. I've never abused anybody. I know people who have been abused. Okay. And when you read that for the first time, boy, the hair in the back of my neck just stood up. And I still feel that. I've got a lot of anxiety going. I think he really could have used a different example. I think that's I get your point, but I think it's a poor example that, to use abuse, rape, murder as well as my dad abused me.
It's overly simplistic, and I don't think it takes into consider the trauma factors that go along with this particular thing. So I think you're right. I agree with you, Tony, that it's a poor kind of use or a poor, example of the point that he's trying to make. At the same time, Tony, did I cut you off? I'm so sorry.
No. I like what you just said.
Yeah, I think further down the line, I mean, when you're dealing with people who have trauma and abuse, they sometimes internalize it so much that the goal of therapy is to get them to externalize it, to kind of move and say, oh, okay, so this happened. But I think what he's trying to do is kind of taking a broader scope, saying, you don't want to stay stuck there. Ultimately, people, when we're working with trauma and people have gone through this, is ultimately the impact of abuse falls on what is my responsibility in terms of how I want to react. It's not that it's my responsibility that I have to take for the abuse happening, but it's what am I going to do with that? But that comes at a certain point in therapy. It's not something that you're going to work on right in the midst of dealing with the trauma work. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
Well
I agree with you. I agree with you 100%. But I think it's a really poor example.
Yeah.
He could have used many other examples other than this, and I think it's, for somebody who just at this point isn't open to what you've just said, this could be even more harmful. But I do agree with you 100%. Just a really bad example, in my opinion.
I know in doing with addiction work, there are a lot of clients where they have a go-to excuse or a go-to reason for why they're going to get high. And it could be a very good reason, like I was abused, but if that reason becomes, I saw my grandmother die in front of me, right? Every time I think of that, I want to get high. So I have a built-in ready-made excuse at the ready, and I think that's kind of what he was talking about there. And he does start that sentence with the word sometimes, right? So he wasn't suggesting that this is a built-in thing for everyone, but the sometimes, and I've seen those sometimes all too often with addictions.
Yeah.
Where that trauma story is part of the narrative and it's part of the handshake, the introduction, and it's like, I'm amazed when I learn about somebody's abuse in the first 5 minutes of an interaction, right? What does that mean for that?
Yeah.
I think we do have to take responsibility, and until we do that, I see that can stop us completely, and we can't move forward until we do take the personal responsibility. So I agree with both of you completely. Maybe putting sometimes maybe could have made me feel a little better.
I can't.
Are you muted?
No.
Oh, sorry.
I kind of agree with you, Tony. I mean, it occurs to me a couple things. I mean, sometimes people just need help. They just need help. They may never have been exposed to the idea that they have agency, that they can be effective, that they have free will, that they can make changes. But the other thing that occurs to me is that if someone is abused early in life, cognitively, neurologically, they're organized differently than someone who is fortunate to grow up healthy. And so they may require a different kind of help for what essentially is the neurological, the physical healing to get to the point where they can conceive of personal choice and free will. So the thing just occurs to me, sometimes people need help. It can't just kind of go from being abused and being a victim, and then somehow there's something that happens and they discover that they can do something different in life and be different in life. Sometimes people need some help.
Mm.
Strike that sentence, blame the victim or play the victim, I found is very unforgiving.
Hmm.
Because there's some, I see in pediatrics too, there's this one girl that stood out. I haven't seen her for years now, but she was sex trafficked at 12 years old. And she's broken. She has a lot of healing for years and years to come. She was the victim. She is the victim. And like Dr. Wilson says, it changes the thing in your brain. And the way I spoke with her, she's very pleasing to be with, but it's a facade. She wants to say things that you want to hear to please the physician or the nurse.
Easy.
Yeah. So that's how she coped. That's how she's coping.
Mm.
That takes a lot of years to heal.
It does.
Ellen, I appreciate you saying that, and Dr. Wilson, you too. I was abused as a child until I was 10 years old and suffered lifetime trauma because of that. I also, whether it is inherited genetically or as a result of that, because that jury's out, but I have bipolar. And I still react to things differently than quote unquote normal people. Okay. But I don't want to throw Richard Rohr under the bus here. He said, when God made humankind in the beginning, he's quoting from Ben Sirach, when God made humankind in the beginning, he made them free to make their own decisions. The decisions I can make are to take medication. The decisions I can make are to seek therapy and counseling. So I'm not bereft of decisions. I have decisions I can make, and I'm responsible to make those. You see what I'm saying? Even though my brain is wired differently through no fault of my own. So thought I'd toss it out there. I'm backing up Richard on this. He did use the word sometimes. Sometimes we go further and either blame the victim or play the victim. Play the victim would be real easy for me, but that's not going to get me unstuck. That's not going to help me get better. So.
Well, I had the same reaction in reading this the first time. I flagged it in the margins here. And so I did definitely wanted to have this conversation. Tony just kicked it off preeminently. But I think what Ken has said is kind of sums up my reaction as well. Yeah, the way it reads here and maybe the example he used was a little bit too broad of a brush. And maybe it sounds like it's judging or unforgiving, but I think his point still holds in that ultimately, once they get all the help that Danielle and Brady are talking about, or maybe the mental health that Ellen is talking about, and get to a place of some sort of baseline, then it really is going to be that person exercising their free will to make changes in your life. And that goes right to what William was saying. There are some people who now take on victimhood as a warm blanket, and it's much more comforting to stay in that space, or to turn that blame outward, to absolve themselves from the hard work that it's going to take to untie some of those knots that we're talking about. I mean, someone like Ellen is talking about, or Danielle has seen in her work. There's some deeply tied knots there. So it's going to take work, but we need to exercise our will and freedom of will to be able to do that work. And that means that we need to take a look inside. We can't keep externalizing that blame. So I think his point holds, but we need to put all the caveats and disclaimers in place for ourselves so that we are still being conscious and of the problems that people are facing in their lives by the time we get to meet them, right?
Mm.
Have we beat that particular horse enough for the moment?
Yeah, good enough for me.
Okay, let's continue on. Where did we leave off? So once Christians lose a deep appreciation for the perfect law of freedom, Okay, this is what he's talking about, that own capacity for free will. The very foundations of morality and dignity are destroyed. So we're becoming something, in his estimation, of the way I'm reading this, something less than fully human if we're not exercising what makes us human. And what really separates us from the rest of the animal kingdom is our ability to choose, to have that free agency to choose between good or evil, or to choose what love requires in a given moment. If we are abdicating that, then we're losing our human morality and even dignity, if I'm paraphrasing him correctly. When God made humankind in the beginning, he made them free to make their own decisions. Now that's a quote directly out of Ben Sirach, which is one of the apocryphal books of the Bible.
Just say,
the
who
Latin,
is he?
I'm sorry, say again?
Who is he, Ben Sirach?
Oh, that's the name of the book.
Oh.
Okay, so Sirach is the prophet who is speaking in the book itself.
Oh,
Are
okay.
you all familiar with the Apocrypha and what the Apocrypha is?
No.
Okay. If you are a Catholic, if you grew up Catholic, if you have a Catholic Bible, then between the two testaments, between the Old Testament and the New Testament, there will be the Apocrypha, which is, depending on how the church counts it, somewhere between 14 and 16 books. These books, the reason that they're in the Catholic Bible and they're not in the Protestant Bibles, they also do occur in Orthodox Bibles, but in different counts, is that there was a Greek translation of the Hebrew Tanakh, which is the Hebrew scriptures that we call the Old Testament, that was written about the 2nd century BCE in Alexandria in Egypt. And it contained all of these books, these 14 and 16 books we're talking about. Now, the Western Church used the Septuagint, it's called, this Greek translation, directly in translating into the Latin that became the Roman Catholic version of the Bible. The Jews, on the other hand, when they, after the destruction of the temple in 70 BCE, or CE, I should say, they retreated and reinvented Judaism because it could no longer be a temple-based or sacrificial-based system. It had now to be a home-based, synagogue-based, and mitzvah-based system. So doing good deeds rather than sacrificing at the temple. And in doing that, they decided to codify all of their oral traditions. So they wrote the Talmud and all the associated books with the Talmud. And they also closed their canon. They decided which books of all the Jewish, pantheon of literature were approved and inspired by God and which were not. They left out these 14 or 16 books in the 1st century, and then wrote and then continued that going forward. In 1517, when Luther began the Protestant Reformation, they wanted to get rid of all things that were Roman, everything that was Roman Catholic. So they went back not to the Septuagint and not to the Latin versions of the Bible. They went all the way back to the Hebrew version of the Bible. And since that version did not count these books, they didn't count them either, because they were just trying to get shut from Rome. So the Protestants in the last 500 years have not included these books. The Roman Catholics still do, and the Orthodox do to a certain extent. But even Luther himself said he's not going to say that these books are canon. They're not proven to be inspired by God, but he said they're still very good for reading and study and for inspiration. So he didn't say that they were heretical. He just said he couldn't prove that they were canonical. If you've ever read the Apocrypha, there's a big difference in the quality of the books that are there. There's a book called Bel and the Dragon, which is attached to Daniel, and it's really fanciful. It reads more like science fiction or fantasy, and it's clearly of a different order than the other books of the Bible. But then you read something like Ben Sirach, or you read, it's called Ecclesiasticus in the Latin version, or you read something like the Book of Wisdom, and it stands up beautifully, and they're just incredible books. So pick your poison, right? At any rate, Father Rohr is a Catholic. So he is also reading the Apocrypha as if it's canon, because that's his tradition. So he is quoting Ben Sirach, where he says, when God made humankind in the beginning, he made them free to make their own decisions. or left him in the hand of his own counsel is another translation to that line. But you can see where he's going with this, right? And then even more daringly, he's going to quote Genesis now. We were told at the very beginning we could eat of all the trees of the garden. Now, it's interesting to me that he leaves out the next phrase, which was except the tree that was right in the center of the garden, which was the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. I don't know why he leaves that out, because there was that one exception there. But I thought that was interesting. But his next point, I think, is a central one. God is surely a risk taker, all for the sake of a deep and authentic love. And this is something that I've considered deeply myself, is that why is the world the way it is? Why is there so much evil in the sense of the way that people treat each other, the decisions they make, and all the unloving things that are done to each other? We were just talking about sex trafficking. I mean, it's hard to imagine anything more heinous than that. How is that being allowed? But if you think about it, love requires a free choice. If love is coerced in any way, if it is manipulated in any way, it's no longer love. And so in order for us to be able to love as God loves, we had to have an absolute free choice. How do we know that choice is free? Well, because we're making so many unloving choices. That's how we know it's free. In fact, the whole role of Satan, Hasatan, in Hebrew understanding, is to provide that alternative, to provide that unloving choice. Because if we didn't have an alternative or a choice, we would never know if our choice was really free. Interesting, huh? Yeah. The devil, Satan, becomes an employee of God, furthering God's agenda and will, not in opposition to it, but making it real. So what he's basically, the way I would put it is that God risked losing us in order to actually have us as co-lovers in the universe. But he had to risk losing us in order to make that happen. The way he puts it, God is surely a big risk taker, all for the sake of a deep and authentic love. I think he's talking about the same idea.
I think that's a good place to default, because when bad things happen, we always want to default to the why, right? And I've had to relinquish that. And I think there was the most freedom in my life when I started relinquishing that whole why, because when I got attached to the why, it just didn't make sense. You know, God being omnipresent and all the omnis, right? Why couldn't he have prevented? But it's because of his big love, right? It's because of that big love. And that's the why for me. And that's where I default to.
In fact, I've gone so far as to say that all the evil we see in the world that is human caused is actually proof of love.
Yes.
For that very reason.
Yes.
That makes sense. Right.
Greatest act of love is to set something free, right? Whether it's a person or whatever it happens to be. If you love it enough, you will set it free. Because then he has the ability to actually love in return. Or not. You have to take the same risk that God takes, right?
Good point.
Brings back the saying that I've heard, that love isn't love until you give it away.
Isn't that a song?
If not, it should be. Come on, John, write one. Yeah, all those love cliches come back, you know. Darn if they're not true. A lot of them. Okay, well, any other thoughts along those lines? Let's go further forward. He says it takes real spiritual and emotional maturity to recognize that our response always and finally comes from us, even if it is much easier to put the responsibility and shame elsewhere instead of finding our own inner freedom. And I think we've already pretty much hit that, you know, this idea of the beginning of change being the accepting of our own responsibility. And maybe accepting our own powerlessness, obviously. The first step of the 12 steps. That is the beginning. That we have to realize that the change needs to come from within. And Jesus is big on this. He's always saying, hey, it's not out there someplace, whether it's kingdom or whatever. It's within. It's among. It's in the midst of. It's right here. It's not out there. Don't keep searching out there. Look within. That's where you're going to find it. And then he talks about projecting our dark reservoir elsewhere relieves us of a huge burden. You know, if our egos are still in charge, we will almost certainly resort to this common survival technique. And so that goes back to, is kind of foreshadowing this last line that Ken was highlighting. All of life is pulled inside me as a central reference point, and that is far too small a world. Remember, we were talking about solipsism earlier? This is another way of looking at solipsism. All of life is pulled inside of me as a central reference point. Solipsism being that self-centered point of view, self as the center, or even further, self is the only thing that we can ever know for sure from a philosophical point of view. And so all of life is pulled inside of me as a central reference point. So that would be a solipsistic point of view. And that's far too small a world. As Jesus would put it, such people have not lost themselves, so they cannot find themselves either. And it's so interesting to be able to, in this larger sense, take Jesus' phrases and words and paradoxical phrases and put them into these deeply psychological terms, because that's really where they live. He's talking about this inner working, all of these difficulties that we face psychologically and emotionally in terms of our development and our growth. Jesus is addressing those before there was even a glimmer of psychology as we know it today. But it's deeply spiritual at the same time.
And how much of this, I'm reflecting back on all of the spiritual warfare conferences I went to, and how much of this do we see in the image of Satan? That, how much do we project a lot of that onto Satan, so to speak?
Mm-hmm.
Where does that all fit in?
Yeah, this is what I hear from my the other ladies I go to in our Bible study is like, I have these anxious ideas, and what they'll tell me is that's Satan talking to me. Right. No, that's not Satan. That's me. It's my anxious thoughts. That's me and my triggers and my baggages.
Right. Or programming. Mm-hmm.
Right.
Well, I remember when I worked in the prison center, like almost always when you saw one of the prison inmates like clutching a Bible and walking around, and then when you talk to them, they would tell you that the devil had a hold of me when I was out there committing these crimes, and it was my fault.
Mm-hmm. And they're putting on the full armor of God, trying to resist the urges. Yeah.
I'm saved and redeemed. Yep.
Yeah. But that imagery helps a lot of people, you know what I'm saying? But I wonder, and I hate to stay out of judgment. I hope this doesn't come out as of judgment, but it feels like a stage 2 if we're looking at Scott Peck's, where we need to have something to project onto. It just brings us order to think that would be the reason.
Mm-hmm. I think there's a place for it, and especially early on in our development. It's just like you need the law as an actual law to obey at the beginning, but then you need to graduate the law and move beyond it, because if you get stuck just in obeying your way to God, then you're just on a hamster wheel ultimately. But I think it's really necessary at the beginning, just like when we're raising children, they just need to obey you. You can't take the time to explain to a 3-year-old or a toddler why certain rules are in place. Just don't touch the stove and don't go in the street because mom said so, period. You just need to keep them alive long enough so maybe you can
Right.
reason with them later. And I think spiritual warfare can serve some of the same place, because it's so powerful in us guarding ourselves against some of our own proclivities, I suppose, but to discharge that outward, into Satan can be, I think, real useful. That idea of girding yourself, but I think it's something that does need to be graduated from eventually, because otherwise, again, we're abdicating our own responsibility for making change from the inside out. If it's always the devil made me do it, then I'm just a victim. We have to make this distinction between powerlessness and victimhood, because we can be powerless and not a victim, because a victim has no choice in the matter. Their humanity has been taken away in their victimhood. But we can be powerless over these things, but we still have a choice. Our choice is to avail ourselves of the power that's greater than ourselves. The people around us, the counselors around us, the community around us, unseen God, all of the above. So in powerlessness, we still have a choice. In victimhood, we don't. We do not want to get stuck in victimhood, even if it's at the hands of spiritual warfare.
I agree with all that you said. I think I would like to believe that we don't need that stage 2 stuff, kind of like a child needs a parent, to say don't touch the hot stove and all that. I wonder what a spiritual development might look like if we introduced this kind of a concept of, because of big love, evil exists. Because of this, as opposed to having to instill that whole thing that there's a Satan and there's a hell and all of that. What do you think about that?
Interesting point. I don't know if it's possible to leapfrog, over identification with the group. It may or may not be possible. I wouldn't teach it, especially not now. And I always had a hard time kind of getting my arms around it anyway, when I was younger, but that was just me. But I think there is a point at which we really do need to identify with the group. I think that's part of the development process. So I don't know if we can get away with that, but without that, but maybe.
Yeah, I don't know.
That might be a good thing to think about. And
yeah, I was thinking of John, our John, who kind of didn't grow up in that group. You know what I mean? And he kind of leapfrogged a little bit, where he just kind of led with the lost and then finding the love, right?
Yeah, but you forget his affinity for the Dallas Cowboys.
Well,
see, there are all kinds of groups that we can identify with. They don't have to be religious.
He can't be redeemed from that, I don't think. So.
He's lost forever.
Well, then again, there are those of us that are stuck with the Broncos. So
it could be worse. Yes.
It could be worse.
John was also, I don't know if you know this, John was also in the military and served in Vietnam, which is another group that you really end up becoming identified with. Now, I don't know how identified he was with it. It would be something that, he doesn't like to talk about it. Like, maybe I shouldn't even have outed him, but that is another, kind of a stage 2, where you become part of the group, and the group think is your think, and it's obviously in the military, it's a means of survival. So it's not a bad thing.
Dave, but I was thinking about like a long spiritual line specifically, like needing a church with rules and so on and so forth. And it seemed like he leapfrogged that piece.
Well, his first church was the effect. So he's got a lot of other things to be screwed up over, but maybe not that. That's interesting. His first church was the effect. Think about that. He comes out of addiction. And through addiction, he is introduced to us on Tuesday nights, which was our recovery gathering, and just falls in love. He was just a conversion waiting to happen. I mean, he was just at that point where it was right at his eyeballs, and then it popped through. So he's a real interesting case.
I'm
I
great
feel
with
like
that.
he always wants to help.
Always. Mhm.
Yeah.
Total servant's heart.
What was that? Sorry.
He's got a complete servant's heart. Servant's heart.
Yeah.
So Richard is going to move on here, and this is where he's going to start to introduce the idea of positive emotions, also creating problems. Most spiritual people think we only have to watch out for the negative or nasty passions like anger, conceit, envy, avarice, fear, and lust. But after years of observing both myself and many that I have directed, I have come to see that so-called positive emotions and excitements can be just as blinding and narrowing in their practical effect as negative ones. This is a surprise for most of us. Do you know that passions for the early church usually referred to something we suffer and suffer from? The passion of the Christ, right? That would be his suffering, in contradistinction to something we consciously and freely choose to do. Passion was not usually referring to sex as we use it today, but that also seems too narrow to me. That's not the only place we use passion. We use passion to denote our bliss, don't we? If you're passionate about something, if it just
Follow your
pops you out of bed.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Danielle.
No, I was just going to say, follow your passion. We hear that with all the coaching and all the therapies out there. Find your bliss. Follow your passion.
Okay.
Yeah, but also keep in mind, Dave, and you referred to this, I think, last time with William, we talked about this with the Enneagram. The passion is also kind of that core, maybe fear or suffering that you have deep down that you are reacting to in life when you show up for life. So each number that you identify with, it has its own passion. And, what are some of them, William? Like, sloth and envy and different things, anger, stuff like that, where it's way down deep, but it's considered a passion because it's so rooted in you. But it can be good or bad, really, depending on how you respond to it.
So the 7 deadly sins are referred to as passions in the Enneagram? Is that what
Yeah.
But they actually do assign some of the 7 deadly sins to each of the numbers, don't they, William? I think
Yes.
so.
Oh yeah, I've seen that too. So this may be Father Richard's celibacy talking, where he's focused on passion as sex. I don't know. But at any rate, I think we can broaden the scope of passion beyond just sexual passion. But it's just our bliss. It's just what we are, are just maybe attuned to, have a natural affiliation for, affection for, all these things. A passion is probably much closer to what we now mean by an addiction or some compulsive unconscious behavior. I don't know if I would only attach that negative value to passion. I think passion can be positive, but as we were talking about earlier, and I think it was Ken brought this up, or somebody brought this up, I think where he's going with this is that the passion, by its pleasurable nature, in a positive sense, can be addictive. It can be something that then we are chasing for that high, for that effect, rather than allowing ourselves to be completely present to the moment. It can take over.
It can. What was that last part?
Can take over and become identified with it.
No.
So
But I also see it like some people, let's say the person has a passion for golf and he loves it, but it's also a way to escape your duties or obligation for something else.
Right.
It's a form of escape, right?
Absolutely. I think we can come up with all sorts of scenarios how we see that the things that we are most passionate about can obviously be misdirecting and diverting as well.
Oh yeah. I remember in one of the couples books that we were reading, the authors had a whole list of really good things that people can engage in, whether it's, you're a voracious reader, or you love to exercise, or you're an extreme sports person, or what have you, that can, you can find your bliss in that. But I mean, I think their point was anything taken to excess is going to get you on the decline and separate you from people eventually. And they were using that as an example of, almost when that starts happening between a couple. She had a word for it, but it was like, it was, you're heading for a divorce, but you're not paying attention to those signs and signals that you might be avoiding issues in your marriage that need to be attended to.
Mm.
Kind of like that drip, drip, drip with the throwing the frog and a nice, cool bath, and then gradually warming it up. Doesn't notice that it's getting bad.
Yep. So these positive passions are really a lot sneakier than the negative ones, because we end up attaching virtue to it. And then we feel free to just, pursue it with abandon to the exclusion of so much else, kind of the way Judy's painting out with a marriage scenario. But that's the key here, that it's the middle road that we're always trying to hit. The truth is not at the extremes. The truth is going to be in that sacred tension in the middle of things. That is we can still call it a passionate middle. It doesn't mean, when we think of the middle as being sort of milquetoast, we think of the middle as being, just kind of white and flavorless. That's not what we're talking about. The middle is the hardest position to maintain, not the easiest. I mean, to hold those things in tension, to constantly bring the extremes into some sort of balance in middle, takes so much more energy, awareness, and maturity than flopping down to one extreme or the other. And so remember, the middle is the one the position that takes the most faith, the most courage, so on, and perseverance and everything else, and so on and so forth. So that's what we're trying to hit. So when we talk about dispassion, that doesn't mean that we don't still have passion for things, but we're not allowing ourselves to identify with them to the point that they take over and they distract us and divert us from still being able to be really present.
Yeah.
Think of a new convert to the faith. They can often be the most obnoxious and annoying people on the planet, because they are so taken with everything that they're feeling, all those consolations, all these great highs that they're feeling. And of course, they want everyone to feel exactly the way they're feeling, and so on and so forth. And so they can be completely unaware and oblivious to who you are and to who everyone is around them, because they're inside their own bubble at the time. That's the kind of thing we're trying to avoid on either the positive or the negative side in the contemplative life.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, it's what I call the Goldilocks principle. This is too hot, this is too cold. You have to find just right.
Yeah. Well, actually, this is probably a good place to stop now that I look at it, rather than diving into the next paragraph, because we're right at time. Any other thoughts or comments? Some of you have been pretty quiet.
Dave, what's his name? Russ Hudson or whatever, the Enneagram guy. I like his definition of passions. He said a passion is a longing of the heart that just doesn't go away.
That's not bad. Yeah.
Also, when they say passion of Christ, that's the suffering. Because I associate that with the Stations of the Cross. Is that the suffering of Christ, the crucifixion?
Yeah, that's what Richard Rohr said, that the early church associated passion with suffering, or something that you were suffering from. And so the passions of Christ were along the Via Dolorosa, right? It was the passion of his torture and crucifixion and all of that. So passions, the martyrs, all face their passions that led to their death. So passion can mean a lot of things here. You know, yes, it can be an erotic passion. It can be the passion of suffering and pain. And it can also be just forms of our bliss, or as William said, you know, the longing of the heart that doesn't go away. It's all of the above. That's why we got to be careful to make sure that we understand what we're talking about when we use a blanket term like that. I like that one, William. That's a very descriptive definition.
It makes sense to me, what I could pick up, you know.
Okay. Any last parting shots? All right.
One last thought I had was
Go for it.
Ken was talking about this earlier about, you know, the thought that keeps popping into my mind is that we become addicted to our own thoughts. Right. So like that's one of the positive addictions, right? It's like I know why I think what I think. Right. And you know, I can get lost in my own thoughts for hours where I have an audience that agrees with me and, you know, every perspective I take is right. And that keeps me from losing myself, right? Like that line of like, such people have not lost themselves, so they cannot find themselves. So if you get so stuck in your thoughts that you haven't had the opportunity to recognize that your thoughts are wrong.
Yeah.
So that's all you get.
But I think even beyond that, William, it doesn't matter whether your thoughts are right or wrong. If you're constantly having them, then you haven't got the opportunity to actually lose yourself in the moment.
Right. Right.
I have
we're never going to know what this is all about.
I would like to just say that you're talking about passion of Christ, the suffering of Christ, and whatnot. We're talking about passion and suffering, and you know, we're all, and Dave, you know, we're all recovering from something, and however great or small. I think it's beautiful that we bring it here. And that said, I want to say welcome to a very dear, passionate about her life. Well, I just
at a crucial moment, John. Welcome to what?
I want to say welcome to a very dear friend of ours, all of ours, who has been here with us this evening, Lori. We love you, and we're so glad you're here.
Amen to that.
Oh,
thanks, John.
I'm glad you're here, Lori.
Thank you. That's very kind of you.
Yeah.
Beautiful way to end tonight. So, Gotti, are you here?
I'm here.
Yes. Go for it.
Father God, thank you for this time together as we explore the possibilities and the choices and the different situations that our life experiences as we live it out. And we're just glad we can live it out with you as head of our lives, as the example, because you never let us down when we focus on your truth and your love. Thank you for being with us. We ask you to bless this teaching and help us to gather out of it that which is worthy of holding on to. And thank you for all that you're doing in all of our lives. We love you, Lord. We pray and give our thanks in Jesus' holy name. Amen.
Amen.
No, just wait, real quickly before we go, I just want you all to know that these book studies are, I think, becoming the most watched and listened to thing that we have posted on the internet. There are lots of people who watch these that have found us by all sorts of different means, who I only know about them because they're starting to comment underneath the actual archive sessions. So they are really appreciating the kind of conversation we're having and where we're taking this material. So thank you for being as open and transparent as you are, because it's affecting a lot of people that we don't even know it's affecting. is what I'm saying.
Wow.
This has been really, really great. So thanks everybody, and we'll see you
Thank
Sunday.
you.
Thank you,
Thanks.
Dave.
Thanks,
you.
everybody.
Thanks for sharing that.
Bye-bye.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye, everybody.
Good night, all. Good night, all. Good night.
Good night.
Good night, everyone. Good night, John
Good night,
Boy.
Patricia, Sandy. Good night, Sandy. Jordana and Linda. Good night, you guys. I'll see you soon.
See you guys later.
All right, bye-bye.
Sweet.